Hello, and thank you for accessing this video. It is the first of a new channel that I call the Critical Adjunct, as I am a critical adjunct. I've been teaching as an adjunct professor since retiring after the better part of 4 decades as a business executive and earning a doctorate in human and organizational learning and leadership. The purpose of the channel will be to discuss social, educational, business, and even emotional issues of the day, and criticize where criticism is needed and compliment where it's not. Hopefully it will be a serious channel, but not without some humor or humorous videos presented or topics. The purpose of this video, which is part 1 of 2, is to discuss systemic racism. Some may ask, what gives you, a white person, the right to talk about racism? And my answer to that would be that I was born during World War II, and that makes me a member of the silent birth cohort, which spanned from 1927 to 1945. And as a result, growing up in the late 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s, I grew up at a time when systemic racism was a reality. Moreover, I experienced it, or perhaps more accurately, witnessed systemic racism when, as a member of the United States Air Force, I was stationed at Fort Lee, Virginia, near Petersburg, as the Air Force sent myself and several of my basic training mates there to tech school. On one of our many weekend passes while at tech school, some of us chose not to leave post. And 3 of us, two white guys and a black guy, were shooting pool on Saturday morning when the 2 white guys got the notion that they did not want to stay on post and wanted to go to see a movie in Richmond. And so we asked our black friend to go, and he was very reluctant. It was obvious that he did not want to go, but after several minutes of pleading with him to join us, off we went to Richmond. We chose a movie that all 3 of us thought we would like. I went to the ticket window to purchase the tickets. I asked for 3 adult tickets. The attendant looked down his nose at me and said, "You and him," pointing to both of us white guys. "Okay, him, no effing way." The 2 white guys, we just looked at each other, stunned, and then we turned to look at our black friend, and he just nodded his head as if to say, "Told you." And so he knew exactly what was going to happen and why. 2 weeks later, I had to go into Petersburg for a medical test. When I arrived at the clinic, I saw a separate entrance for white and black. I walked in, saw separate water fountains for each. And I didn't know it at the time, but when I walked into the black bathroom, it became real clear to me that I was in the wrong place and needed to get out. Again, I simply thought I was in a different universe. And quite frankly, I have never really gotten over either of those experiences. It made a significant impression on me. And so, to General Milley's desire to have all military personnel read books like White Rage and White Fragility, which is okay if the individuals want to read them. I intend to read them. But my experience was an example of white rage as I see it. Might be completely different from what you think white rage is about and what those books think white rage is about. But those experiences certainly enraged me when my friend and I could not enjoy a movie together. My friend, who, when we were stationed at our permanent location in California, was my roommate. And so when I hear people, especially young people, talking about systemic racism, and when I say young, I'm not talking about kids. Obviously, I'm no young person. So I mean younger than me, that were born maybe near the change of the centuries, or maybe even sooner than that. I wonder if they have ever witnessed what I witnessed in Virginia. And so my argument to them is that before we can talk about systemic racism, we need to define it. And it seems to me that no one's making an attempt to define it. And if I'm going to criticize something, I need to be able to define it before I criticize it. And so I thought it best to come up with my definition of systemic racism first. And so I'll share it with you. The definition that I am most comfortable with is that in order to be systemic, racist behavior and practices must be codified in an organization, like it was at the theater in Richmond and the doctor's office in Petersburg. Behavior in organizations that is either encoded in written rules or unwritten rules and understandings and expectations that all members of the organization are to follow, whether written down or not, is what I would say is systemic racism. And I would argue that we don't have anything like we had in the early 1960s and before in our organizations. I'm not going to try to convince everyone that there aren't biased people in organizations, and maybe even organizations that have codified racism. one way or the other. But I will argue that they are by far fewer than the codified systemic racism that existed in the Jim Crow South and perhaps even in the non-Jim Crow North. It seems to me that unless racist behavior is codified or identified as acceptable and expected, it cannot be systematic. And no one has a right to call it systematic. Does that mean there are no racists or there isn't biased people in organizations today? Absolutely no. But just because there are racists among us doesn't give anyone the right to call it systemic. What we should be focused on is calling out the racists among us and encouraging those with unconscious bias to recognize it for what it is and do something about it. And that concludes part one. In part two, I will focus more on unconscious bias. And I thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it meaningful. And if you liked it, I hope you give it a thumbs up. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.